After 1943, coffee disappeared completely from the dining tables of most households in Germany. It was not because people no longer needed it, but because within a few months it became one of the most obvious casualties of the war. The Allied naval blockade cut off the sea routes from South America and East Africa into Europe, and with Germany's limited colonial resources, almost unable to sustain imports, coffee, even when it occasionally appeared on the market, circulated on the black market by the gram. Ordinary people were left only with ersatz café, a substitute made from roasted chicory, malt, and dried acorns. Its color was similar to real coffee, but it had no aroma, only a faint, charred bitterness, as if reminding people that normal life was receding from them, little by little. For Luise Herrmann, coffee was not only a taste, but also a form of order. She grew up in the Ruhr industrial region, where her father worked in a coal mine and her mother managed the household accounts. In her childhood, coffee was the only food in the house that carried a sense of ritual. Every Sunday morning, regardless of whether the factory chimneys outside were releasing thick smoke or not, her father would grind a small handful of precious coffee beans. That aroma, mixed with the ink of the newspaper and the coal dust on the windowsill, was one of the brightest scents in her memory. As the war deepened, that scent first faded, then vanished, replaced by the harsh bitterness of substitutes. Her family stopped looking forward to coffee because it no longer belonged to them. After reaching adulthood, she entered an air defense intelligence unit and became an operator of radar and communications data. It was a position on which wartime Germany depended heavily, with strict training and a low replacement rate. Each day she sat in a command hut camouflaged as a warehouse, receiving signals through headphones and quickly marking flight paths on recording paper. The more frequent the bombing, the tighter her handwriting became. During night shifts, the entire structure would tremble slightly from the concussion of anti-aircraft fire, dust falling from the ceiling onto the plotting boards, and the air often carried a mixture of oil, damp wood, and scorched rubber. She grew used to micro-sleep, used to darkness, and used to that cup of odorless substitute in the early morning because it was the only fragment of routine she could still hold on to. Political education was part of her work. One idea was repeated constantly in the lessons. The American army would use soft control in the management of prisoners, weakening their will to resist through excessive food, sweet drinks, and real coffee. This kind of information was instilled in an extremely systematic manner, from the lecturer's spoken explanations to the case descriptions that appeared again and again in wartime newspapers, all reinforcing one logic. The enemy would not conquer prisoners through force of arms, but would undermine their judgment through food and comfort. Luise internalized this more deeply than many of her colleagues because she knew that real coffee could awaken her memories of normal life. And in wartime, memory often meant vulnerability. So she secretly set a bottom line for herself. If she ever fell into enemy hands, she would never go near the enemy's coffee. That bottom line held until the spring of 1945. At that time, the defensive line in the Ruhr region was rapidly collapsing, and the American offensive was advancing at an irreversible pace. The unit she belonged to first experienced communications lines being cut, then equipment being evacuated, and finally, during a forced relocation, they were encircled on the outskirts of a small town. Resistance was brief and confused. The situation quickly froze, and she was captured together with other non-combat personnel. On the form, the registering officer wrote her identity as Air Defense Support Personnel. This label placed her among the prisoners classified as lowest risk, who would not be held in temporary detention cells but would instead be counted and transported to the rear. On the way to the port under escort, she realized for the first time what a real industrial gap meant. The railway lines were still intact, transport vehicles were clean and well maintained, and the port machinery ran continuously. To her, these scenes did not look like those of an enemy country, but like another world far from the front. And in the air of this world, a familiar yet abrupt smell flashed by. It was the aroma of coffee drifting from a field kitchen truck in the distance, clean and sharp, almost indistinguishable from her childhood memories. She turned her head instinctively in the column, not out of desire, but out of fear. She thought of the warnings from training, thought of that sentence, "Coffee can change a prisoner's judgment." She did not know how much truth there was in that statement, but at this moment the smell was too close, so close that it made her tense up by reflex. After boarding the transport ship bound for the United States, she found that there were still traces of coffee in the morning air. The galley would prepare hot drinks before dawn, and the steam spread through the gaps in the ship's hull. She did not go near that area, yet each day she would catch a faint hint of the aroma. She regarded this as a kind of test, and also as a danger signal. In the dim quarters, she often silently warned herself, whatever happens, she must not allow this smell to become a dependence. The transport ship moved slowly across the Atlantic. The prisoners were strictly divided into sections, with space cramped but order clear. The daily routine was fixed: roll call, rations, inspection, rest. The women's section where she was held was relatively quiet, and from time to time she could hear the low sound of the hull striking the waves. Unlike German supply ships, this vessel never stopped along the way and never showed any sign of running short of food. Almost every morning, the galley would emit the sound of metal pots being heated, and following that sound, there would always come a more conspicuous aroma, strong, clean, and unmasked. Real coffee. In the confined ship's quarters, it was especially noticeable, like a shock that seemed to pierce through the steel plates, making her tense up immediately in that half-awake state. She tried her best not to smell it, not to look at it, but the air on the ship was too limited. Whenever someone carrying a hot drink passed through the corridor, the aroma would seep through the gaps. She pulled her scarf up to her nose, not for warmth, but to block out that smell which unsettled her at the bottom of her heart. She understood that the root of her fear was not only propaganda, but also her own memories of coffee. It symbolized home, symbolized the past, and symbolized everything that the war had destroyed. The more she tried to stay away, the more she felt her mind being pressed tight. By the later stages of the voyage, she even learned to distinguish the speed at which steam rose, as if preparing her defenses in advance. When the ship finally docked at a military port somewhere in the American South, the temperature of the air was different from that in Europe. The humidity was higher, the wind warmer, the port facilities well maintained, and the machinery never stopped working. She was led out of the hold and moved along a corridor of barbed wire with other German prisoners. At the very moment she set foot on land, she smelled that familiar aroma again, this time even richer. U.S. Army field kitchen trucks were parked outside the passage, and soldiers lined up for hot drinks, the dark liquid reflecting a faint light in the morning sun. The moment she looked up, she saw the steam clearly rise like a white line cutting straight across her field of vision. At that instant, her back tightened, and she almost instinctively turned sideways, hiding herself on the other side of the column. In the afternoon, the column was taken to the prisoner of war camp. The camp was larger than she had expected, with wooden barracks in neat rows, barbed wire clearly marking the boundaries, and watchtowers commanding a wide view. At the entrance, Army medics carried out an initial examination, measuring temperatures and recording identities, strictly following procedures in what felt like part of a large registration system. When she followed the column into the camp, the first thing she saw was not imprisonment, but a kind of order so calm it was almost frightening. Dinner was served in the central camp dining hall. As she moved forward with the line and past the entrance, she noticed that the food preparation area was well supplied, with boilers, insulated containers, and beverage barrels arranged in an orderly fashion. The most conspicuous among them were the large metal coffee urns placed in the middle of the wooden tables. They were constantly refilled by the kitchen staff, and every time a lid was opened, steam would rush out with the aroma, spreading straight through the hall. She stopped for half a second without thinking, because she knew that was the place she had to avoid. She deliberately walked along the outer side of the line, taking only soup, bread, and fruit. She did not look at the coffee, did not approach it, and even the way she held her tray became stiff, as if she were warding off an invisible threat. During the meal, she observed that many prisoners took coffee of their own accord, moving naturally and without hesitation. Some showed obvious satisfaction after the first sip, some quickly became more alert, and some clearly recovered from post-labor fatigue. When she saw these changes, her heart tightened. For her, these were all signs of mental loosening, the beginning of developing misplaced trust in the enemy that propaganda had emphasized repeatedly. She had no evidence, yet instinctively regarded it as dangerous. Back in the barracks at night, she found it hard to fall asleep for a long time. She was not troubled by the fear of being confined behind barbed wire, but by a lighter, harder-to-describe pressure. She felt as if she were surrounded by an invisible test, with the smell of coffee appearing every morning, as if reminding her she must persist, must remain vigilant, must not become the kind of person that propaganda had described, whose will was being weakened. So she pressed the pillow over her ears, trying to push the smell further away. In the weeks that followed, this tension became the background of her daily life. She sorted tools in the work area, packed goods in the food warehouse, and helped with maintenance in the cleaning crew, yet always kept her guard up toward the direction of the kitchen. Whenever the morning mist lifted and the smell of coffee spread, she would instinctively tighten her grip on whatever tool she was holding and shrink her mind into a thin line. She kept her distance from those who drank coffee and did not join their conversations, simply maintaining as much separation as she could. The camp's system soon revealed a kind of stability she had never experienced before. Every morning after roll call, the guards checked the numbers row by row and then assigned prisoners to different work details. She was placed in a light labor group, usually responsible for tasks such as organizing farm tools, sorting warehouse goods, packing food, or assisting with simple work on nearby farms. These tasks were strictly kept within the limits allowed by the Geneva Conventions, neither involving military secrets nor entailing hazardous operations. Yet these procedures in themselves did not reassure her, because behind the system there remained another rhythm that she could not control. Coffee was the most stable element in the daily rhythm. The kitchen started brewing the first batch before dawn, and the aroma spread quickly in the damp air. She never went near the urns, but on the way to each work assignment she smelled it repeatedly. It slipped through the gaps between the barracks, mixed with the smell of wood and earth, and always occupied a clear place in the layers of the air. She noticed one frequently recurring fact. Every prisoner who had drunk coffee seemed able to adapt to the work rhythm more quickly, and their mental state was more stable than the day before. She knew this could be due to the physiological effect of a hot drink, yet the warnings from propaganda weighed more heavily on her, making her repeatedly interpret such improvements as part of a design by the enemy. She did not dare to walk too close to those who drank coffee and always shifted slightly toward the rear of the line, making herself the person who kept a safe distance from others. Educational activities in the camp took place in the evening, including language classes, basic carpentry or agricultural skills, all presented as prisoner programs. She saw many German prisoners volunteer to attend, especially after having that cup of hot drink in the morning. Their attention seemed more focused and their movements lighter. She misread all of this and attributed it to a chain reaction of psychological influence. In her mind, coffee was not just a beverage, but a switch. Once flipped, it would weaken the prisoner's tension and vigilance. At the same time, the way the Americans ran the camp was difficult for her to understand. The guards enforced discipline strictly, but did not go out of their way to oppress. The prisoners' routes, working hours, rest periods, and medical needs all followed clear procedures, and almost every link reflected institutionalization rather than hostility. Red Cross personnel entered the camp every few weeks, checking food rations, inspecting hygiene, recording prisoners' health, and even asking in detail whether the intensity of the work was appropriate. This cool pairing of inspections and practical procedures was nothing like the scenes she had been taught, in which the enemy would never respect any treaty. Yet, precisely because of this institutional nature, she felt even more uneasy. She could not tell whether the Americans were genuinely like this, or whether it was to serve some strategic purpose. She still regarded coffee as part of the external structure, viewing it as a buffering agent designed to work in tandem with the system. Every time she saw a guard taking a cup of coffee before changing shifts, she even took it as a sign that even their own side is being controlled. This misreading made her mental state extremely taut, while her body was being worn down day by day. The habits formed during the early war years, short, shallow sleep, physical tension, and sensitivity to noise, did not disappear automatically in the camp, but remained as a kind of chronic fatigue. The labor was far lighter than at the front, but the weather was hot and humid, the sun was strong, and her physical recovery was slower than it had been at home. At night, she often lay awake listening to the faint clatter of utensils being cleaned in the distant kitchen, only slowly falling asleep deep into the night. The lack of rest made her steps heavier and heavier. Her body began displaying some subtle but obvious changes. While working, she would occasionally feel her vision grow dark, and when turning around, she sometimes experienced brief bouts of dizziness. She knew clearly that this was the result of exhaustion, yet she stubbornly refused to acknowledge it, and did not want others to notice. She explained all her discomfort as the humidity in the camp being too high, or the fatigue of unfamiliar labor, but would not face the real cause, extreme strain from prolonged psychological tension. This condition reached its peak one particular morning. The mist had not yet lifted that day. The air was more humid than usual, and the smell of coffee spread even more quickly in the moisture. She stood very straight in the roll call line, as if using her posture to resist the aroma entering her breathing. She thought she could still maintain control, but in the span of those few dozen seconds she suddenly felt a wave of weakness in her chest, followed by a slight trembling in her legs. She tried to take a deep breath, only to find that the air seemed to have been cut off. Then she finally encountered the signs she herself had not anticipated: cold palms, narrowing field of vision, and an unfamiliar buzzing in her ears. She tried to stand firm, but could only rely on instinct and inertia to keep from collapsing. The shapes around her grew unstable in her eyes, and the light seemed to fracture. She felt her body sinking rapidly as her consciousness floated ever higher away. Just as she thought she was about to fall into the mud, a hand caught her firmly. In the very second when she almost lost the ability to stand, a camp kitchen orderly was passing by with the breakfast supply line and happened to see her swaying. The soldier did not hesitate. Acting purely on his basic duties, he quickly reached out to support her shoulder, keeping her from pitching forward into the damp ground. Luise did not see the man's face clearly. She only saw the service number on his chest and the mess detail insignia on his sleeve. She tried to straighten up, but found that her legs could no longer bear her weight. The soldier steadied her with one hand and raised the metal cup in his other hand to her. The cup was still steaming, the dark liquid almost touching the rim. At this moment, her will was more rigid than her body, yet her body was already beginning to tremble. She wanted to lift her hand and push it away, but she no longer had the strength to raise her arm and could only rely on what little remained of her strength to stay conscious. In the next second, the metal cup was pressed into her palm. The temperature of the tin cup wall shot through her skin straight into her nerves, bringing her consciousness into focus in an instant. She knew she should refuse, because the choice in that moment seemed to conflict with everything she had been trained to do. Yet, she also realized that if she did not drink, she would faint on the spot, and she no longer had the strength to keep resisting physically. As the rim of the cup drew nearer to her lips, her breathing paused for an instant. She did not smell any dangerous odor described in propaganda, nor did she feel any unusual CG, only a simple wave of heat. In the end, she did drink that first mouthful. The moment the taste spread across her tongue, her mind seemed to wake up rapidly. It was not the woody bitterness of chicory substitutes, nor the thin flavor of diluted ersatz drinks, but something solid, direct, and marked by roasted aroma. As the heat carried the caffeine into her stomach, her body produced a clear reaction within seconds. Her heartbeat steadied, her vision righted itself, and her fingers regained strength. She did not immediately realize that this was the ordinary physiological improvement brought by a cup of hot drink, because her attention was seized entirely by the surge of memory the taste set off. At that moment, she suddenly recalled the sound of her father grinding beans on Sunday mornings, recalled the kitchen of her childhood, and recalled that ordinary life which had not yet been severed by war. Yet the most powerful impact did not come from the coffee itself, but from the fact that, after drinking it, her mind was not weakened, her judgment did not become clouded, and her will did not slacken. Her body had clearly recovered, but her awareness was extremely clear. There were no hallucinations, no euphoria, and none of the dangerous reactions that had been drummed into her repeatedly. She was helped by the kitchen orderly to sit aside, the metal cup still firmly in her hand. For the first time, she was able to observe her surroundings calmly, and what she saw did not match the scenes depicted in the propaganda. No one tried to take advantage of her weakness. No one gathered around to watch her reaction, and no one changed their attitude toward her because she had drunk a cup of coffee. Everyone simply went on with their work, moving supplies, checking the line, and organizing tools. That cup of coffee did not become the starting point of any operation. It was merely an incidental act in the course of daily routine. She realized that what she was facing was not manipulation, but the most ordinary response of a busy soldier who saw someone about to collapse. The naturalness of that act, devoid of strategy or insinuation, made her feel for the first time that there was a massive gap between the warnings from her training and the reality before her. As her observations accumulated, the structure in Luise's mind began to change. She realized that she had long used a one-dimensional framework to understand the world, ignoring the complexity of reality. In the Air Defense Intelligence Unit, she had been used to judging threats by signals and flight paths by data, but she had never learned to judge people and institutions from multiple angles. The war had bound enemy and danger together, bound resources and strategy together, bound coffee and psychological control together. In this camp, for the first time, she realized she did not need to continue using these habitual judgments. She did not intentionally tell anyone about her change, nor did she openly articulate her renewed understanding. She simply allowed her observations to become more open, her judgments to be more delayed, and her attitude toward coffee to become less distorted. Every morning, when the scent once again slowly rose over the camp, she no longer turned away or tensed up, but let it blend into the background sounds around her. The aroma remained distinct, but no longer felt threatening. In the summer of 1945, the rhythm of the camp began to shift subtly. Broadcasts brought news of Germany's unconditional surrender, new repatriation lists were posted at the registration office, Red Cross inspections became more frequent, and the stacks of paperwork for sending prisoners home grew higher. Conversations among the prisoners no longer centered on labor and routine, but on their hometowns, the jobs they had held before the war, and the families they were unsure they would ever see again. There were no celebrations in the camp and no disorder either. There was only a quiet loosening, like a heavy stone on the chest being moved aside part way. Luise remained calmer than most. She knew that returning home meant confronting a place transformed by bombardment. She had no romantic expectations of the future, only the clear understanding that she had to go back and see what shape her life had been forced into by the war. Trucks transported the prisoners to the port. The sun of the American South shone on the damp ground, full of vitality, and as she looked at these scenes, she became aware that she was about to leave a world that had never been interrupted by war. The ship crossed the Atlantic once more. The homeward journey was smooth and lacked the earlier tension. Many people talked on deck about reconstruction and the future, some about post-war industrial jobs, some about agricultural restructuring, some worrying whether their families had survived. The air no longer felt heavy, even though the sea wind was as cold as ever. When they reached a European port, the first step ashore brought not hope, but shock. The concrete of the docks was cracked, cranes stood idle, tracks had been twisted by explosions, and warehouses were reduced to bare walls. She walked along temporary passages, past a row of ruins, seeing charred ship hulls and piles of destroyed goods. At that moment, the finely tuned, uninterrupted logistics system she had seen in the American POW camp stood in stark contrast to the ruin before her, making her directly feel the extent to which war had damaged her country's basic infrastructure. The procedures at the repatriation center were chaotic but necessary. She was placed in the return group for the Ruhr, and spent several days reaching familiar geography. The scenery along the way left each prisoner silent. Rubble stacked along the railway, whole sections of city centre collapsed, chimneys broken, dense bomb craters lining the streets. Many places no longer looked like cities, but like old maps eroded by rain with blurred outlines and exposed bones. When the Ruhr industrial region finally came into view, she truly understood what post-war meant. Though the smoke had cleared, the smell of scorched earth in the air told her that the industrial heartland had been hit by countless air raids over the previous 2 years. After walking just 2 streets, she no longer needed to look for evidence. Houses had split apart, window frames were empty like hollow shells, factory girders bent like burned branches, and the power substation at the corner was a blackened ruin with only part of the switchgear still standing in the rain. Her home was among the ruins. The roof had collapsed, the walls were shattered, and only one corner of the wooden table protruded from the rubble. She stood at the doorway, trying to find anything familiar, found that almost all traces of daily life were gone. Everything that had once made her feel warm, newspapers, ceramic cups, curtains, the Sunday morning smell of coffee, lay buried under broken stone. She bent down and lifted that corner of the table. Beneath the grain of the wood was a dark brown old stain, a coffee ring. Time and dust had blurred it, but it was still discernible. This was where her father had always placed his cup, and it was also the most stable image in her childhood memory. Now, that mark seemed like a hand reaching up from the rubble, making her pause her breathing for a moment. She finally understood. It was not the enemy's drink, so common in their hands, that had taken coffee away from Germans' lives, but the war itself. The war had made her doubt ordinary warmth. The war had led her to see the traces of daily life as threats. The war had made her believe that a smell alone could alter thoughts. And what had truly been altered was her ability to understand the world. That night, in a rented room, she brewed her first pot of coffee since the war. The fire on the stove was quiet, the water heated slowly, and the coffee grounds settled at the bottom. When the steam rose, she did not step back or tense up. She simply watched as the aroma spread through the air, as if stitching a broken piece of memory back into place. When she took the first sip, she did not think of the enemy, did not think of propaganda, and did not think of the prisoner of war camp. She thought of peace. Peace made coffee once again become coffee, no longer a weapon and no longer a danger. Peace made life once again constructed from small details instead of from fear. Peace made her realize that the coffee she had drunk in the camp had not been a means of control, but had salvaged a part of her world. From that day onward, she stored this experience in the deepest part of her memory. She never exaggerated the kindness of the American POW camp, nor did she romanticize the hardships of the post-war years. She merely told those who came after her with honesty that war leads people to misinterpret the everyday as conspiracy, whereas peace allows all ordinary things to regain their original meaning. In the years that followed, Luise seldom took the initiative to talk about the war, nor did she like to emphasize her role as either victim or participant. She knew that the reality of that period was far more complex than any single narrative, and what she could do was to preserve the details that had neither been exaggerated nor concealed, letting them become part of how the next generation understood the war rather than slogans repeated after being fed to them. She regarded that cup of coffee in the camp as a turning point, yet she never romanticized it. It was not redemption, nor the decisive moment of her life, but a seemingly insignificant instant. A person exhausted to the limit being handed a hot drink at daybreak, and that drink happened to overlap with her deepest memories of ordinary life. The real change came from her realization that during those years when she'd been taught that the enemy will stop at nothing, her own judgment had been continually shaped by the war itself. She understood that misunderstandings do not vanish by themselves. They must be shattered by some concrete, specific event. In her life, that event happened to be a cup of coffee. It did not change her political convictions, nor did it make her forget her country or her experiences, but it forced her, for the first time, to face a fact. She had been compelled to believe in an overly singular world, and the world had never been singular. As Reconstruction advanced, the Ruhr industrial region gradually revived. Factories resumed operation, railways were laid again, and chimneys were lit once more. At times she would walk through the streets in the early morning and see workers stepping into workshops with hot drinks in their hands. The aroma was no different from that in her earlier memories, but now it was no longer tied to the war. She realized that this very ordinariness was the most precious part of peace. It did not need to be emphasized or turned into a symbol. It only needed to quietly reclaim its place in people's lives. Luise understood finally that life could recover not through grand gestures, but through small, ordinary details. Through a cup of coffee, through a hot meal, through the mundane rhythm of daily work, people could regain the fragile sense of control, memory, and identity that war had stripped from them. The smell of coffee had not been a weapon. It had been a bridge back to herself, a subtle signal that the world beyond fear still existed. She kept this understanding quietly, letting it shape her approach to the post-war years, rebuilding not only her home, but also her perception of ordinary life. In this way, the cup of coffee became a symbol, not of power or propaganda, but of resilience, memory, and the restoration of daily order. It reminded her that survival was not just about enduring hardship, but about reclaiming small fragments of life that give structure, comfort, and continuity to existence. And with each sip she took in later years, she carried with her both the memory of fear and the awareness of how fragile yet persistent ordinary human life can be.